back in 1995, when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I was searching around for many possibilities that could have caused a global cataclysm in the range of 12 to 13,000 years ago, because that's what all the astronomy pointed at, 12 to 13,000 years ago. And Hapgood's theory seemed to me a very valuable and useful one. I still won't write it off. I won't dismiss it entirely, but I've shifted in the direction of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, simply because I'm in a constant argument with mainstream academia. And the issue to me, the most important issue to me, is the issue of a global cataclysm at the end of the Ice Age. What caused that cataclysm is a secondary issue. The cataclysm itself is the primary issue. And I found the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis a better, much more scientifically grounded explanation for that cataclysm than the notion of Earth crust displacement.
But do any archaeologists or any of these prehistorians dispute the Younger Dryas?
There's still a lot of argument around it. There's about 60 major scientists who are involved in the Comet Research Group. They're all credentialed scientists. They've all published dozens of papers in peer-reviewed journals, including Nature, including Scientific Reports, and many, many others on the hypothesis. But there's also a group of academics who are opposed to it and dispute that any impact ever took place. And then, even in those who do accept that the Younger Dryas was a cataclysm, some think that it may have been caused by solar activity rather than by comet impact.
How would that work?
Well, it could work at the end of the Younger Dryas. There are two moments in the Younger Dryas. The beginning is 12,800 years ago. It's a very strange moment in Earth history. This is when This is when the world's climate, which has been warming up for a few thousand years, the Ice Age is still very much present. Have big ice caps on North America, big ice caps on Northern Europe, but it's been warming up gradually. And then 12,800 years ago, two things happened at once. First, a sudden cataclysmic drop in climate. It gets incredibly cold. As cold as it was at the peak of the Ice Age more than 20,000 years ago. It gets incredibly cold, but then puzzlingly, there's a release of water into the world ocean. I say puzzlingly because when the Earth is freezing, you would not expect meltwater to be going into the world ocean. It should be staying on the ice caps. And I cite the work of Cesare Miliani and his work on the submergence of Bahamian corals. This is how do you know that sea level rose? There are certain corals that can only exist within a certain number of feet of the sea's surface.
Because they need the sunlight.
Yeah, and when they drown, that tells you the sea level has risen. And they point to a significant sea level rise 12,800 years ago at exactly the moment of this deep freeze. The comet impact hypothesis explains that, because it says that the shock at the heat of the impact of large fragments of a comet on the North American and European ice caps would have been sufficient to release that freezing water into the world ocean, to cut the Gulf Stream. That's the central heating system of our planet. It's called the global meridional overturning circulation. It's these currents of warm and cold water that flow around the planet, and the Gulf Stream was cut and the Earth got extremely cold. So I think the comet impact hypothesis does best explain that. But
so just real quick, so comet hits, cuts the Gulf Stream. Cutting the Gulf Stream
cuts the Gulf Stream because it releases a huge quantity of meltwater from the North American ice cap almost instantaneously.
So the comet hits the ice that is in North America.
And Europe.
And Europe. That water cuts the Gulf Stream because it releases all this, which was frozen
freezing water. Goes into the world ocean.
And temperature plummets.
Temperature plummets.
But at the same time, there's much more potential water in the oceans, so that when the temperature does rise, now you have that meltwater.
Well, no, so now we need to go on. 12,800 years ago, in the 1,000 or 1,200 years after that, that's a window when all the great Ice Age megafauna go extinct.
Megafauna are?
Saber-toothed tigers, woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths. The whole collection of famous Ice Age megafauna, they all go extinct in that window. And clearly, they didn't go extinct for no reason. It's the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas that made them extinct.
Have you seen the, oh God, what is the gentleman's name? He's a guy who I believe excavates up in Alaska for gold. I'm pretty sure it is, I'm forgetting what it is right now. But they're like images of woolly mammoths who have had like their legs completely shattered, but they're intact.
Yeah. And is this a boneyard that's been
Yes,
found?
yeah.
That's right. That's very, very, very interesting. I've not been there. I've not looked into it yet, so I can't speak authoritatively about it.
But it might speak to your opinion right there. Like,
what I can say is that at Serrania de Lindosa in Colombia, there is an 8-kilometer long rock art panel dated to 12,800 years ago, which shows these megafauna. It shows many of the extinct megafauna from that period. To get back to the point, so we have this window of about 1,200 years where the Earth is very cold, the megafauna go extinct. But then 11,600 years ago, just as fast and dramatically as the Earth went cold, the Earth goes warm. You're looking at a 10-degree rise in global temperatures in a couple of hundred years. It goes very, very, in geological terms, very rapid and very fast. And sea level rises very quickly.
And what is the cause of that?
11,600 years ago, it's called meltwater pulse 1b. There's another collapse of the ice sheets and huge amounts of water go into the world ocean. Now that could realistically be caused by a sudden burst of solar activity, which melted down those ice sheets. But that's not what I go with. I still prefer the notion that we're dealing with multiple bombardments from comet fragments. And in this case, you're looking at a comet fragment that goes into a world ocean, that sends up a huge amount of water vapor into the upper atmosphere, creates a greenhouse effect, and accounts for the warming that takes place at that time.
So 2 comets. One that cooled things down and one that heated things up?
Yeah.
Any idea why one would cool down and one would heat up?
Depends where the impact is. If the impact's on an ice cap and it's releasing enormous amounts of meltwater into the world ocean, you're going to make the world very cold. Okay. If the impact's in a world ocean and it's putting a huge amount of water vapor into the upper atmosphere, it's a greenhouse effect. And the world is going to get warmer. It's all theory. It's not fact. What is fact is the sudden warming at the end of the Younger Dryas and the sudden freezing at the beginning of the Younger Dryas.
So we're searching for explanations for that.
We're searching for explanations. I've picked the one I back, but I'm not claiming that I have to be right. It's what I do think is really important is recognizing this was a global cataclysm. It was sustained. It wasn't just a minute. It went on for 1,000 years plus, and it's in our backyard. It's in very relatively recent human history. We're almost at the edge of history when we go to 11,600 years ago. That's weirdly the date that Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is built, 11,600 years ago. That weirdly is the date that Plato's Timaeus and Critias gives for the submergence of Atlantis, 11,600 years ago, before our time.
So what's happening to humanity in this 1,200-year window?
I need to be clear about that. Okay, because archaeologists roll their eyes at any mention of Atlantis. If you even say the word Atlantis, you're automatically regarded as a member of the lunatic fringe.
Okay.
And if you've even said that word, all your work, all the 30 years of work you've done, the 1,000 dives that you've done on continental shelves all around the world, all of those can be written off simply because you said the word Atlantis.
It's flat Earth for archaeologists.
Yeah, it's flat, flat Earth.
Gotcha.
And they detest the use
Now
of
tell us why the Earth is flat.
Well, that's one theory I definitely don't buy into.
No. Give us the Atlantis theory.
So the story of Atlantis comes down to us from Plato. It's expressed in 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias.
Okay.
Plato was writing at around 300 BC.
Does it come from his uncle?
Yeah, it's arguably from a member of his family line, who was the Greek lawmaker Solon.
Solon, yeah.
Who did make a famous and documented visit to Egypt around the year 600 BC.
And he was told in Egypt.
And he was at the Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta, and there are these inscriptions on the walls. That temple no longer exists. It's a ruin in the Delta now. There are these writings on the walls, and he asks a priest, what do the writings say? And the priest spoke Greek and ancient Egyptian, and he told Solon what the writings say, that there was this great civilization, that it was destroyed in an enormous flood. Plato, or Solon, refers to it as Atlantis. Atlantis is not an ancient Egyptian word. It looks like some attempt to translate into a meaningful Greek phrase what was originally an ancient Egyptian phrase. And that ancient Egyptian phrase, I can tell you pretty much for sure, was the homeland of the primeval ones. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But the point is that then Solon asks, when did this happen? And the priests say, they're very relaxed about it. They say, 9,000 years ago. So immediately we have a date that we can put to our calendar. 600 BC, he makes the visit. 9,000 years before that, that's 9,600 BC. Give or take 23 years, that is 11,600 years ago. That's when Göbekli Tepe is built. That's when meltwater pulse 1b begins to flood the world oceans. And again, my critics will niggle away at the edges of this and say, well, meltwater pulse 1b unfolded over 300 or 400 years. If you average it out, it wasn't that much in any one year. But who says it happened at average rates? Who says there wasn't a big rise and then a smaller rise? You know, these things are very annoying. But the bottom line is 9,000 years before Solon is 9,600 BC. That's the Atlantis date. That's Göbekli Tepe's date. And then secondly, the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt is very important. There's been, I worked with a partial translation.
Edfu is?
Edfu's in Upper Egypt. It's sort of halfway to Aswan, in southern Egypt. It's kind of middle.
Aswan is the quarry, I believe, where they
Aswan's the quarry where they got a lot of the granite that they brought. It's about 500 kilometers south, but Edfu's a bit further north than that. But it's also on the Nile. Now, the Temple of Horus at Edfu is a relatively recent temple, probably built around 270 BC by the Ptolemaic dynasty of ancient Egypt. These were Greeks who had overtaken ancient Egypt. But although they colonized ancient Egypt colonized their minds, and they became ancient Egyptians, more ancient Egyptian than the ancient Egyptians themselves, in many ways.
It's like when white people go to Hawaii.
Inscribed on the wall of that temple, not in the language of ancient Egypt as was spoken 270 BC, but in Middle Egyptian, which goes back to about 2000 BC, carefully inscribed, and we're informed that it's based on temple archives. See that a temple stood there before the Ptolemies rebuilt that temple, and it stood on the foundations of an even older temple. The archives were preserved. That's what's inscribed on the walls. It's inscribed in Middle Egyptian. It's about 2000 BC, and it tells the whole Atlantis story. It just doesn't call it Atlantis. It speaks of a sacred island. It calls it the homeland of the primeval ones. It speaks of a great serpent that comes from the sky and splits the island in two. It speaks of a huge flood that arises and kills off almost all the divine inhabitants, apart from a few survivors, who then travel around the world. One of the places they go to is Egypt, and they make their first business to build primeval mounds in ancient Egypt that will be the places, the locations of all future temples and pyramids. The Edfu texts are very clear. Now, I just need to make this clear, because I relied on Eve Elizabeth Raymond, who was an early translator of the Edfu texts. But recently, the Edfu texts have been completely translated, every single word, into German by a gentleman called Dieter Kurth, and they've translated it all into German. It would be nice if it were all into English, because that's much more widely spoken
What
language.
does it say in German? The Jews did not build the pyramid.
No, it supports everything in the original translation. There's not a single part of the original translation that's debunked by this. It supports it, and it adds information that wasn't there, because the reference in those Edfu texts to the destruction of the homeland of the primeval ones is 7,000 years ago, but that's in Middle Egyptian, which dates back to 2000 BC. So it goes back to 9,000 BC again.
And 9,000 BC is 11,000.
Yeah, it brings us to the same date. So I think that Egyptologists have been too hasty to dismiss Plato's story.
Real quick, so we can just understand what was said. The snake that comes down, like you said in the Netflix special, we can look at comets as potentially snakes.
Cosmic serpents.
So this comet that comes and hits the island of Atlantis, that's like a direct shot.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But so maybe it doesn't hit exactly the island, but it's hitting close enough where the effects of that hit are going to dramatically affect the island.
And remember, they didn't call it Atlantis. They called it the homeland of the primeval.
And what does that mean, the primeval ones?
The ancient ones lived there. That was their homeland.
Whoever that created the mounds.
Who then, their survivors, who included 7 sages, traveled around the world seeking to rebuild their lost civilization.
And we've heard this.
And Egypt was one of the places they went to.
Okay, now, some people say that Azores Plateau might be Atlantis. Have you ever been there? And maybe we can describe really quickly where that is.
Well, it's in the Mid-Atlantic and on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is interesting because there's a phenomenon called isostasy. Isostasy is the Earth's surface is a little bit fluid. If you put a heavy weight on one bit of it, it's like the end of a seesaw. It's going to force the other bit up. So in Britain, we had an ice cap on northern Scotland. But right now, the Isle of Wight in the English Channel, far to the south, is sinking beneath the ocean. Why is that? Because the ice cap on northern Scotland pushed northern Scotland down and lifted up the Isle of Wight. Since the ice cap's gone, the Isle of Wight is going back underwater.
You see this in the islands off of Italy, like Capri is starting to shift and rotate a little bit.
It's isostasy that causes that. And isostatic rebound in this case. And there is some indication that the ice cap on North America may have had an effect on the mid-Atlantic ridge and may have raised it to a higher level than it was today.
Oh, so wait a minute.
But I'm not, I need to be clear. I'm not looking for Atlantis there or anywhere. I don't think there was one location. Every story and reference, and I don't think we should be looking for a genetic location for it either.
Right.
Just as it would be really hard to look for a genetic location of America today, the US culture is a multicultural society. There's the multi-ethnicity society. I suspect quote-unquote Atlantis was like that. I suspect that it was all over the world, that it occupied the best real estate on Earth, the lands that are now under a few hundred feet of water caused by.
But if we knew where it was, we could at least look for some sort of remains.
If there were if there was a definite heartland for it, I think we should be looking for those remains on the flooded continental shelves all around the world, and that's what I spent 7 years of my life doing. Was diving on the continental shelves and finding again and again ruins and structures that weren't supposed to be there. I think there's the whole story of humanity that's missing underwater. And while I'm saying that, I would like to give credit to archaeologists. There is some work now being done, marine archaeology, which isn't any longer just looking for shipwrecks from the medieval period or even from the 20th century, but 19th century, but are looking at the flooded continental shelves. And it's just starting. This work should have been happening for decades. It's just beginning. I think that's going to reveal a great deal. And I know it's going to reveal a great deal because I found a great deal. But I want to add that the Amazon rainforest and the Sahara Desert are also underserved by archaeology.
Yes.
And we can't claim that there was no lost civilization of the Ice Age while there's so much of the world we never looked at all.
Especially the Sahara Desert, right? Because there could be thousands of pyramids just covered in mounds of sand right now.
They really could.
We are finding a lot in the Amazon.
Yes.
Yeah, the LiDAR in the Amazon.
The LiDAR work in the Amazon is fascinating.
Okay,
I hope to be back in the Amazon within the next few months.